This is a course on non-conventional energy resources, and in this class we will go through an overview of non-conventional sources of energy, and basically it will be some sort of a summary of the various technologies that we will kind of look through as we go through this course. The term non-conventional source of energy is something that you see quite often in popular literature, and so it means a variety of different things to different people, and in fact if you make a list of all the technologies that come under this category of non-conventional energy resources, you will find actually the list is quite long, and there are a lot of people trying various different technologies with the differing degrees of success. Maybe they are still in the research stage, maybe they are still exploring some initial prototype and so on. So, so there is a pretty large, I would say a fairly significant list of such sources, and what we will look at in this course are the more major versions of these sources, where they have actually been deployed to some degree and actually are already in use at different locations. So, that is basically what we will look at through this course, and also in this class we will highlight some of those major non-conventional sources of energy. So, for the purpose of this class, our learning objectives are to become familiar with the various non-conventional sources of energy. So, I just at least want you to get a sense of what are these names of these non-conventional sources of energy, some basic principles of what is the idea behind that source of energy, how does it actually function, some basic idea of it, because later in the class we may actually spend a fair bit of time on specific versions of these sources that we are discussing today and look at them in much greater detail. This is to serve more as an overview, so to speak, and we would also like to understand the relative advantages and disadvantages of these non-conventional sources of energy. So, each of them is a package of pluses and minuses, and it is sometimes a bit difficult to find any one solution that actually meets all our requirements and is very clean, very good, and something that people are investing on heavily. So, we will look at the pros and cons of each of these technologies as we go forward, and we will see what is I will try to develop our own ideas of what we think is possibly something that we should focus on, maybe look at some areas of concern for some of these technologies that are perhaps not that evident at first glance. So, we need to just do that. So, we will as we go through this overview, I will try to highlight those relative merits and demerits. Okay, I indicated this earlier and I want to highlight that again. The GDP of various nations is often very closely related to energy consumption. So, this is a point that we have to keep in mind, and as we discuss all the material in this course, as we read popular articles, as we look at the political position that is held by different countries at different points in time, many times all of that is linked to this idea that GDP is linked to energy consumption. It is sort of in some ways a natural link and in some ways an unfortunate link. It is a natural link because basically this means I mean if the GDP is high, it means you have a lot of activity, commercial activity that is on, industrial activity that is on, and typically that means there are more industries, there are more factories, there are more places where energy is being demanded and consumed in significant quantities, because all of these factories need a considerable amount of energy and so on, and therefore naturally if GDP is high, energy consumption is high. So, people in fact use the energy consumption as a track of the GDP, and so that is how it has been. I mean if you look at the data, you see this link between the two of them, but the issue is that the area of concern here is that when you link these two together, it seems like we should find ways to increase our energy usage, and that is a little unfortunate way of linking them up, because every time we increase our energy usage, chances are we are also doing more damage to the environment, which finally affects us. It is not just it is not that the environment is some separate entity that out of goodwill that we are taking care of it. That is not how it works. We live in the environment. So, if we affect the environment, it affects us. So, that is the context in which we need to be concerned about the environment. I mean in an altruistic way you may want to take care of the environment regardless of what it does to us, but the truth is it does come back to us. So, it is not like you can do something to the environment, set it aside and then continue doing whatever you want to do. So, it does not work that way. So, generally the energy usage which is typically linked with lot of other aspects such as emissions and so on, finally affects the environment, which finally affects us again. So, therefore, this is a link that is a little unfortunate, but we have to handle, we have to do something about. So, it is very important therefore to find cleaner sources of energy. So, cleaner sources of energy, and particularly if nothing else motivates us, it is to save ourselves. So, that is the bottom line. If if no other motivation is there, at the end of the day, if you use cleaner sources of energy, it gives us a good quality of life, at the same time we are not harming ourselves. So, therefore, this is something of interest to us. Okay, so we will look here in this slide the sources of energy that are presently being used around the world, and I will highlight one aspect of it before I get into it, and I will point to this little bit more as we look at more data in the subsequent slides as well. And that is simply that the data, if you see here, will vary a little bit from source to source to source. So, if you look at if you search for various scientific literature reports on how energy is used around the world, you will find some variations in the percentage. In fact, even in the few slides that I am going to show you, there is going to be a variation. This does not necessarily mean that there is something wrong with the data. It is just that when the data is put together, there are certain aspects that people are focused on, and therefore it is presented in a certain way, because sometimes some energies are clubbed together, sometimes they are separated, and some decision has to be made as to what category should one energy fall under, what category should another energy fall under, etc. And so it is a area for considerable debate. We will that is one important point that I will emphasize to you as we go through this class, that there are different terms that are being used, they mean certain different things. Sometimes we are using them interchangeably. In fact, in popular literature it is often used interchangeably, some of the terms that we are going to discuss today, and because of that we have a general perception that a particular form of energy should fall under some category, but if you look at it a little bit more deeply, maybe it should fall under some other form of category. So, those issues are there, and that is why you see some variation in the numbers as you look at different statistics from different sources. But nevertheless, if you look at the statistic that we have here, if you look at the world energy usage, you will see significant usage coming from oil, based on oil, significant usage based on coal, and significant usage based on natural gas. So, I think if you look at statistics from almost any source that you find that is in any way scientifically reliable, something which has gone through any kind of peer review, and then you are looking at the data, invariably you will find that these three are the major sources of energy, of conventional energy. So, this is I think generally there is a broad agreement on it. So, for example, here I am using this data which is open source, available at the Wikipedia site, but basically similar data you can obtain from different places. You will generally find that these three forms of energy are the largest used internationally. So, in that sense they broadly agree, it does not really matter which source of data you use. So, here for example, I am saying this totals to about 87%. So, that exact percentage may vary a little bit. So, in some cases you may see as low as 80, 78, some cases you may see higher, but generally you will find 80 plus percentage of energy that we consume seems to come from these sources, which is oil, natural gas and coal. So, essentially it is fossil fuel of some nature, right, and that takes up a significant amount of our the usage that we do. So, that is what contributes significantly to the usage that we do. If you look at the others, you have hydro and nuclear as the two other major sources of energy, and there again if you see hydel power stations are there internationally, so many places, and so that contributes to 7%. We will see some aspects associated with it. For the most part in this course we will not really look at nuclear technology at all, but you have to be aware that it is about 4% of supply of our energy comes from nuclear power plants, and so even though you hear nuclear a lot, that puts some sense of perspective on what it is doing. Almost all the other forms of energy that we use actually give us only about 2% of everything that we are doing, and therefore, we have to look at that with some sense of perspective. I will also point out that this is a world energy usage kind of a pie chart. If you actually go to each individual country, you will find that there are differences. Although broadly you will see this kind of a trend, you can see things like what we see as the 2% may actually be a larger chunk of the pie chart of their energy supply. So, that can vary actually quite significantly from country to country. Some nations have taken a lot of initiative to push their clean energy processes up significantly, and so there you will see maybe even a drastically different pie chart from what you see here. But this is approximately true, and certainly if you consider the most major consumers of energy, chances are you will see something very similar to this. So, this is overall world energy usage. Even this I will show you in a slightly different format in our very next slide, but we will take this and we will move this a little further into get little bit more detail and to understand what else we can examine in this kind of pie chart. So, again on your left you see a world energy usage, and you can broadly see here that, for example, I see again the same kind of features here. This data you will see is not exact match of what we saw last in our previous slide, and I will try to highlight what is different about it. So, on your left, first of all you see the world energy usage, and on your right you see renewable energy. Okay, so, these are two different things. This is world energy usage and this is renewable energy on your right hand side. Let me just quickly see what we are looking at from the world energy usage perspective and related to what we just saw in our previous slide. Again you see the three major contributors: petroleum, you see coal, and you see natural gas. Okay, so, here you are looking at a percentage total of these being very close to 80%, not quite the exact 87% mark that I showed you in the previous slide. This is around 80%, 78% is what you are seeing here, but again predominantly it is these three. So, the exact number that you are seeing there is perhaps not as critical, but this general tendency that well over 3/4 of all the energy that we use is coming from these three sources. Now, there is a 19% that is listed here as renewable. So, this source that I am looking at, which is also another source related from another site here, which is also a Wikipedia site, but you can see slight variations here. This is 19% renewable. If you compare against our previous slide, you see hydroelectric power listed there separately. So, that is something that would also you can think of it as renewable. So, these are the places where a lot of thought processes go into what is to be put under what category. I was just indicating to you that you have to think of what category you have to look at things, and so therefore, you can think of this 19% containing contributions like that, which would then be the reason why you arrive at a 19%. And so, that includes that 2% of other that we had in the previous slide. The nuclear remains there. So, even nuclear you see a slight variation, it says 4% here, it says 3% here. So, some variations are going to be there in terms of the exact quantities that you see. You are also going to see some variations based on how those quantities are clubbed together. So, so that is something you should just keep in mind. Therefore, I will also alert you that you do not really have to remember these exact numbers. This is just to give you an idea of what is involved here. It is sufficient that you keep in mind that over 3/4 of the energy we use is sort of fossil fuel related, and then we are looking at other aspects chipping into the energy supply, which come from other sources including renewable, nuclear and so on. So, this renewable energy usage, renewable energies supply is about 19% of the overall global supply, and that again is split into this pie chart that you see on your right hand side, and you will see various names here, some of which you may in fact may not even have heard of that much. So, suddenly you see, if you look at renewable sources of energy, you see this term here biomass and you see this bioheat. Okay, so, between them you are looking at 68%, about 70% of this renewable energy is coming from something that is bio related. Okay, so, we do not when we read popular articles on renewable energy, we look at clean sources of energy, etc. So, articles of that nature, we tend to hear about solar, we tend to hear about wind, and those are maybe the two terms that we hear much more significantly. We also tend to hear about batteries, we hear about fuel cells. These are the kinds of terms that we hear about fairly significantly. But if you look at the statistics, if you look at what you can actually pull together, you see a pie chart like this, where about 70% of this 19%. So, this is 19% is what is being split here into this pie chart on your right hand side. So, this 19%, when you look at the distribution within that 90%, you find that about almost 70% is coming from something that is bio related. So, what that is we will see in a little bit, but we will just keep in mind that there is such a thing, and then we are not really often discussing it. So, we will keep that. Hydropower is listed here, 23% of the energy that we are getting in the form of renewable energy is hydropower, which basically means typically means dams of different kinds, different sizes and capacities, typically that is there. And then you have a lot of small contributors, a huge number of small contributors. So, just to run you through them, we have wind, which is about 2%, there is still something more bio, there is ethanol which can be used, there is solar heating that you see here, there is solar PV, which means photovoltaic, which you see there, then there is something called biodiesel, then we see geothermal sources, and then you see ocean power. Right. So, I am listing 0% here for ocean power and solar PV, primarily because their contribution is so small that in the scale of this chart you almost cannot see them. So, that is how small the contribution of these two sources of energy is to the overall pie chart, but they do exist, people are working on them. So, you will see if you look around internationally, you will find sites where you have power plants which are solar PV based or photovoltaic based or ocean power based. So, so the 0 does not mean that there is no such plant, it simply means it is very small to show in this in the scale of this figure, and that is why it is simply being shown as 0%. It basically means it is much less than 1%. So, that is the situation we are dealing with. So, you see this range, you see this diversity in the sources of energy that are renewable, that we are currently utilizing and making use of. Okay. So, we will keep this in mind, if necessary we will revisit some of these ideas as we move forward. So, already in this class we have used some terms which are the terms that are also present in the popular literature, and I think it is a good time for us to pause a moment and consider these terms a little bit more carefully to see what is it exactly we are trying to express when we use those terms. So, there are three terms here, one is non-conventional energy, the other is renewable energy, and I will put in this third term here which says clean energy. Often in popular literature you find these three terms being used interchangeably. Okay, so, when somebody says non-conventional energy, it somehow registers in your mind as something that is clean, that is something that is environmentally friendly. When somebody says renewable energy, again that is the same idea that registers in our mind, oh it is clean energy, it is something positive that we should utilize and so on. So, that is the common usage situation, that we tend to look at these three terms as being basically the same term, and that you can use them interchangeably, and quite possibly in many articles they are used interchangeably. However, you need to look at these terms a bit more carefully to understand what exactly are these terms referring to, and also at least put in our thought process into what these terms are referring to, and really gauge for ourselves whether they really can be used interchangeably, or if we need to be cautious about their usage in an interchangeable manner. So, first of all, if you look at this term non-conventional, that itself is a very difficult term to pin down accurately. Okay, so, when we say non-conventional, it means different things. So, first thing is it simply means it is not the most common way in which we are doing something. So, that is basically what it means, it is not the most common way in which we are doing something. However, we have to remember that this is being used only in today's context. So, when you say non-conventional, it is non-conventional from the perspective of what is happening today. So, in fact, in some cases, as you will see, in some cases when you say non-conventional, if you actually go back even 100 years ago, that was conventional. It was the conventional way in which we were using energy 100 years, 200 years ago, and in fact for fair part of human history, something that we were doing was conventional way of doing it, and only in the last say 100 years or so we have drastically shifted the way in which we are doing things. So what was conventional a while back may sometimes look non-conventional at this point, or may get classified as non-conventional at this point, simply because it is not the majority of what we are doing. So that is the thing that we have to keep in mind. So that is the point about non-conventional energy. Then there is renewable energy. Renewable energy simply means you can renew the source of energy, that is all it means. So or at least in either we can renew the source of energy, or nature automatically renews the source of energy. So at a time scale and I know at a rate that is something that is in line with how we are using that energy, right. So in principle, if you wait, if you stop using fossil fuels now and then you wait another 20 million years, you may get back fossil fuel. That does not mean it is renewable energy, right. So we want it in this time scale, in the time scale that we are currently using it. So we consume some energy over the next 5 years, can that energy be replenished in the same 5 years? If we consume energy through the month, can it be replenished through the month? Per day we are consuming some energy, same day will it come back as source of energy for us? So or the very next day it is available. So if it is something that we can sort of regenerate or is available to us in a in an inexhaustible form, then that is something that we are considering as renewable, right. So that is the second aspect of it, the fact that it can be renewed at a time within a time frame or in a time scale that is in line with the rate at which we are using it. So that is how we call renewable energy. So that is the second term that we have used. The third is the idea of clean energy. So this is again something that has a specific connotation. When we say something is clean, it at least in today's discussion of energy, it means it is clean with respect to the environment, which means you already have a certain environment around us which has a certain distribution of gases, a certain distribution of temperatures and heat and so on, and as long as the process of generating energy and consuming energy is such that we are not disrupting what already exists in the environment in any manner. It's neither are we doing some spill somewhere, we are not releasing some noxious gases into the atmosphere, we are not changing the composition of the atmosphere. If we take all that into account and it still happens to function in a manner that is not impacting the environment in any manner, it stays kind of benign with respect to the environment, or only releases things that are already there in the environment in the sort of the same composition that it is already there in the environment. If you sort of maintain all these kinds of things, then you can call that energy as clean energy. Okay. So again I have gone through 3 terms and tried to highlight what they represent: non-conventional energy, renewable energy and clean energy, and maybe now you have some sense of individually what they mean, but I still want to press home the point that they are slightly different, and that is what we will do in our next slide. So my basic point that I want to convey in this discussion, in this part of our discussion, is that we have 3 terms: non-conventional energy, we have clean energy and we have renewable energy. So if you look at all the technologies that are available to us to generate energy, all the possible technologies that are used in small scale or large scale, etc., and if you classify them, if you set aside the so called conventional ones, if you set aside the direct fossil fuel ones for the moment, and then you just look at what remains, we find that they can all be clubbed into 3 different categories. Some of them are non-conventional, some of them are clean and some of them are renewable. And if you draw this kind of a Venn diagram, you find that actually you can make groupings which are not necessarily completely overlapping, and that is the reason why we have to be careful when we see an article where these terms are being used interchangeably. They are not exactly equal to each other, that is the point that I wish to make. You can easily have a source of energy that is renewable, which means you consume it and it is available to you again, right. You can create such a source, but the process of using that energy can be very polluting. We will see examples of that. So just the fact that it is renewable, just the fact that you can get it back, or you can get it back at a time scale, or you can at least try to get it back in a time scale that is similar to the time scale in which you are using it, does not necessarily mean that it is clean, right. So you may be doing something which is quite damaging in the process. So everything that is renewable is not necessarily clean. Everything that is non-conventional is again not necessarily clean. And as I said, again the idea of non-conventional itself is questionable, because some of these things were conventional just 100 or 150 years ago, and certainly that if you look at more recent human history in this last 500 years or whatever, some of the sources of energy that we discuss today in courses like these are or were conventional at that point in time. Only in the last 50 years or 100 years they have become non-conventional, so to speak, but they are not necessarily clean. So, just because they are non-conventional does not mean they are necessarily clean. So, you can have various combinations, and maybe when we look at each source of energy, we will highlight this idea that you can have various combinations of them. It may be non-conventional, it may be clean, it may be renewable, or some two of these and not one of them, or just only one of them and not the other two, and so on. And so, there is one overlap in the middle which is always of interest to us, because that is clean, that is renewable, and it is non-conventional. So, that is of interest to us. But really, if you want to look at this from an environmental perspective, truly environmental perspective, if you want to look at, this is the first greatest priority that we have, that it should be a clean source of energy. If it is clean and it is renewable, then this overlap that we see here, this entire overlap that we see here, that is really what is most interesting to us. Whether or not it is conventional or non-conventional is really not that critical to us. I mean, we do not really care whether it is the most recent technology or old technology or ancient technology. That is not as relevant to us, except for curiosity's sake. From scientific curiosity perspective, we can think about that. But what is most important is it clean, and if it is clean, is it renewable? If you have a combination of those two, then we really have a good source of energy, because it means it is something that we can keep on using, we can keep on getting it, it is continues to get renewed as and when we use it, but at the same time it is clean. So, that combination is, I think, much more useful to us, much more of interest to us than anything else, and so that is what we need to look at. So, we will look at, if you look at our previous pie chart that we had here, we see that biomass, something related to biomass, is considered is basically taking about 70% of these renewable sources of energy. So, let us spend a few minutes looking at what is biomass, and then see what we need to consider about it. So, biomass is nothing but burning of wood or other organic matter. So, you see here suddenly you have something renewable, people say non-conventional, those kinds of terms are used, but what is it? It is simply burning of wood, things that I mean for generations people have done, for thousands of years people have been doing. In fact, the first forms of energy that cavemen used was burning of wood. Okay, so if you look back, it is such an ancient technology, you basically burn wood, and the kind of thing that we actually try to discourage people from doing on the streets, people from doing in in various places in the city, which is burning, is exactly what this is. This is just burning of wood and wood or other organic matter. It is considered renewable because if you actually set this up in some organized manner, you can set up some process by which you have a large area of land which is marked as a forest, and you just take say half of it, cut it down, use it for energy, then take the other half of it, and while you are using that other half to create energy, you regenerate the first half. So, you might have to do this in a very planned and organized way to ensure that you are always using that same same amount of organic material, and repeatedly cycling within that within the framework of that organic material that you have available to you. But in concept, if you did this, this is indefinitely renewable. You can keep on growing a forest, burning the forest, growing the forest, burning the forest. So, this is something that you can do, and therefore it is renewable. But the point that you have to remember, and this is why I thought the classification that I just discussed with you is so important, is that this can hardly be considered clean. This is by any stretch of imagination, this is not clean, because you are burning wood. If you burn wood, you will release CO2. So, CO2 is being released, and this wood you got by cutting down half of a forest, right. So, that half forest is no longer available to absorb this CO2. So, you removed that half the forest and you burned that half the forest, and you got yourself energy. So, this cannot be considered as clean. This is not, in my opinion, not a clean form of energy, and even though in fact this has become an issue of contention actually internationally, because in their attempt to meet global standards of environmental cleanliness, people have tried to go away from fossil fuels to biomass, saying that we have stopped using a non-renewable source of energy which is fossil fuel, and we have shifted to a renewable source of energy, which is biomass. Yes, from the description of non-renewable to renewable, this seems like a good shift, but at the end of the day you are releasing CO2. So, you are, in that sense, this is not really in any form really truly a clean form of energy. And in fact, if anything else, chances are this biomass may not be giving you the quality of heat that you want, and you may end up actually having to burn lot more biomass to get similar quality of heat, quantity of heat, and actually do something useful. So, it's chances are you are releasing even more CO2 because you are probably doing this in an inefficient manner, and therefore, it is actually lot less clean than perhaps using certain forms of fossil fuel. So, anyway, biomass is that, it simply relates to this idea that you use something that is organic, that is available, that can actually be created. So, it could be, as I said, trees or other organic matter that you use. So, as you see, large fraction of renewable energy falls under this category, or this consumes a large fraction of that renewable energy pie, but it is not something that we can particularly aim to expand, because it has aspects of it that are not particularly pleasant. Hydropower. Hydropower is again a significant part of that pie chart, and actually has been there for generations. I mean, for at least a few hundred years we see hydel power stations of different capacities that have been around, and in principle, in concept, it is clean power, because you simply have water that is moving. You are just making use of this natural process of water evaporates from the sea, the water cycle, it becomes clouds, it becomes rain somewhere, and then it flows down in rivers. As it flows down in rivers, you construct dams, you convert that collect up the water, convert that potential energy into electrical energy that you can capture using turbines. So, in that sense, it is considered very clean energy, but even there are some issues associated with it. So, for example, if you look at capacities, you can think of some very large capacity dams which are in the 100 megawatts to 10 gigawatts kind of capacity, or maybe even slightly more. So, for example, I think the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is considered the largest power plant in the world, it goes to, I think, close to 20 gigawatts of power is what it is generating. But there are only about a handful which are maybe about 4 or 5 which are in the 10 gigawatts or higher internationally, and then everything else is less than that. But generally a large hydroelectric plant would be in this 100 megawatt to 10 gigawatt kind of power range. Smaller ones are more like up to about 30 megawatts of power range, and generally this kind of capacity is what you will use to power cities and states. So, that is the kind of capacity that you will use. There are also these other versions which are called as micro and pico hydro dams, I will not say dam, hydro power generating units, and they are very small, 5 kilowatt to 100 kilowatt or even below 5 kilowatt. And these are just using small flow of water across some height difference to get you this electricity generated. And if you see the number of 5 kilowatt, that is kind of the power that is required for a house. Typical households which may have a television, a washing machine, a refrigerator, a few air conditioners of different capacities, you are all looking at about 5 kilowatts of usage roughly. So, this kind of a small installation can actually power your house and maybe a few neighboring houses if you set it up correctly. And so, they are often used to power isolated homes and small communities, especially if it is in some wilderness area where you have let us say you are on a hilly terrain and you do have some natural flow of water that is occurring there, and you tap into that natural flow of water. So, these are if you look at the hydro power scenario, the landscape of hydropower, this is the sort of the range that you are looking at. In this, generally today's assumption and today's thought process is that the smaller capacity dams are actually good. The smaller capacity hydro power generating units are actually good in the sense that they are clean, because primarily it is water that is flowing. They are also not that disruptive on the nearby localities, right. These large stations actually do a lot of disruption. Invariably when they are constructed, even from a human perspective, a significant amount of human community settlements are affected, because a lot of people have to be moved. You are suddenly going to raise the level of water in some location in a very significant manner. It impacts the local environment significantly. Often of course this may not seem like much, but often historic sites get submerged. But more than that, often forests get submerged. There are regions where, because the water of the dam has gone up to some level, and it is a freshly constructed dam, some pre-existing forest in that area or pre-existing wilderness in that area gets completely submerged by that water. So, there is significant destruction, environmental destruction due to the construction of large dams. People also argue that when you submerge a forest, the kind of damage you do in terms of not just destroying that forest, but what gets released due to these drowned forests into the atmosphere is also considered kind of harmful. So, there is a lot of debate, there is a lot of discussion and arguments in the international scenario about large dams. So, invariably you will find that is the reason why anytime there is a large dam project, there also seem to be a lot of environmental people objecting to it, raising concerns about it, and that has generally been true of any large hydroelectric power project that has been set up almost anywhere in the world. So, there are concerns about it, but you have to also keep in mind that once it is set up and it is running, it tends to be a clean form of energy. You are not really doing any nothing is being burnt, you are just using the general flow of nature to generate electricity. But increasingly the thought process is that if you have a large if you have a river that is flowing, it is much better to have several smaller hydroelectric generating units along the path of the river, rather than to put one massive dam and create this one massive project. And I think a lot of sense there is there, because it also means your transmission costs are low, you can keep generating at various locations and you transmit very locally. If you see internationally and look at electricity that is generated and transmitted, significant losses are associated with the transmission of the electricity, and so a lot of effort is put in to try and cut that transmission loss down. The best way to cut down this transmission loss is to actually generate the electricity locally or as close to the site of usage as possible. So, having several micro dams or pico dams along the flow of a river is actually in that sense much more useful and clean way of using this energy than putting one massive dam. Even infrastructure wise, it is much easier to do. You can probably set it up much sooner than block up the whole place for a few years to construct the dam, and it does not disrupt the local environment that much. It is all small constructions, and then it keeps running smoothly. So this is something that is of interest. So therefore, people I think generally feel that this is a better route to take than the larger projects. Okay, wind energy is the next major form of energy that we look at when we try to get ourselves clean energy. So in the last several years, maybe last say 20 years or so, lot of interest has been there in wind energy. It has been there traditionally for a long time, but to sort of harness it in a systematic way in a very large scale manner has really happened in the last say 15-20 years. And there are big wind farms around the world which capture this wind energy, capture it and convert it to electricity. I think the largest one is in China. So the largest wind farm happens to be in China. There is one large offshore version of it, which is set up such that it is not taking up land on the in the habited way, habitable places, and that is there in London. It is called the London Array. So that is offshore, and in India we have one large project in Jaisalmer in Rajasthan, which is the largest such wind power generating unit within India. So in fact, this image you see here is also very much from India. It is from the southern state of Kerala. It is actually in I actually got this from the temporary campus of IIT Palakkad. And you can actually see this these windmills if you happen to visit this location, and very appropriately you also see all these wires which are transmitting this electricity somewhere. So so this is very common now. It's available in many places. A lot of people there are specific companies that have specialized in it, and many countries are actually trying to install such wind farms across their geography. There are various issues associated with it because first thing is it is not consistent. It depends really on the wind flow pattern. So not every location you can set this up. You can set this up in some locations, but not in every location. So you have to look at that. You have to see how seasonal variation affects it, and so lot of other parameters are involved here. But you do see some interesting variations on this, interesting ways in which people have tried to extrapolate this process. There are buildings where they try to set up a windmill or a windmill based power generating unit at the topmost floor of that building. Usually there is fairly good breeze at the top floor, and they try to see if they can at least power that building. That is a very interesting way to go about it, because if you can set something up at the top of the building using wind or some other form of like we are going to see solar energy too. If you use all that and capture energy for the building, then you are done. You do not really have to look at transmission losses, you do not have to look at pollution, all that is done within that building. So if you stick to these kinds of clean sources of energy. This is quite clean because you are really doing nothing, you are just taking wind which is already blowing and converting that to electricity. Maybe the only negative aspect of this is that and again it will depend on, when I say it is only negative aspect, for some that may be a significant negative aspect, is that this can affect flying birds. So you have to be a little cautious about that, but other than that I think it is considered a clean form of energy. Solar energy. So this is something that we are all most familiar with. I think of the non-conventional forms of energy that we see, renewable forms of energy that we see, I think maybe wind and solar energy is what we are most familiar with, at least from our popular reading. You keep on hearing about solar energy all the time, and actually broadly in fact solar energy can be tapped in multiple ways, what I am showing you on the slide is maybe the two more prominent ways in which it is tapped, and one is the idea of using a solar panel, which is also called solar photovoltaic. So solar photovoltaic, and this is solar thermal. So you will actually find that these solar thermal units are now in fact available in many households. Install it on the rooftop, maybe in your own house you have this installed, or in your hostels you have it installed, dorms you have it installed. So this is there. In some cities actually it is compulsory that for example I think in Bangalore in India it is, I think at least one of the cities where this seems to be necessary. I think it is legislated that it is necessary, if I am not mistaken, and so almost all the buildings have it, have this solar thermal unit which takes care of hot water requirements for that building. And it is basically, so this is just capturing heat energy from the sun, and solar thermal itself has a wide variation in how it is captured, what is accomplished with it, and so on. So when we get to the solar power we will look at that in greater detail. This is just one implementation of it, and maybe the most common implementation of it that I am showing you right now. And solar PV is again something that is commonplace, relatively speaking. In many cities we find now the the street lamps, street lights have a solar panel attached to it. So it comes as a integrated unit. You have a solar panel, you have a small battery associated with it, and then the solar energy is converted to electricity stored in the battery, and then it runs the street light in the night. So we have all sorts of interesting products that have come up based on the solar panel. This actually is more you have some special semiconducting materials that are used in this panel. So when we get to this solar energy discussion we will look at that in greater detail, and that is used to capture sunlight and convert that to electricity. So there is a process involved in it. We will look at the science behind that process when we get to it. Generally speaking, these are very clean forms of energy, except again here you have to keep in mind that the method that you may use to generate the solar panel should also be harmless. If you finally if you have to fill the world with solar panels, photovoltaic panels, and you use an extremely toxic process to create those solar panels, then that defeats the purpose. So that is another aspect of it that you have to look at. So they sort of talk of this there is always this phrase that is used, cradle to grave, which means from the time you start the technology, start the first step towards creating the technology, till you finally you make it, you use it, and then finally it becomes bad after several years of usage, you finally have to dispose it off, and you find a way to dispose it off. So from the time you start till you dispose it off, all steps should be clean. So only then it is truly clean. I mean, if you want to really make an impact at an international level, at a global scale, and you want it to be clean, then this is something that you have to keep in mind. Is it clean from cradle to grave? So that is the idea that you have to keep in mind. So in that context you have to look at these technologies a bit more closely. But that aside, generally speaking, solar energy is very clean. We are really doing nothing, it is already arriving on our planet, we simply are tapping it, that is it. So, that is the other form of energy that we look at. Geothermal energy. So, this is energy that is already there inside the earth. So, if you go deep inside the earth, maybe even say 1 to say 2 or 3 kilometers deep into the earth, you see temperatures that are extremely hot, right. In fact, I mean some representation of this is what you end up seeing in the form of volcanoes, where it has eventually broken through, and you have this fissure through which lava is coming out, and you see this volcanic eruptions. So, that is anyway happening independently, but this is tapping that energy in a controlled manner. So, this energy is already there under the ground. So, what we basically need is a system by which you inject water through a pipe which goes deep underground, and then goes to a place where the temperature is say a couple of 100 degrees centigrade of that order, and there it just gets converted to steam, and then the steam comes out in another pipe, and so the steam is used to run a turbine, and once it runs the turbine, the steam cools down, becomes water, is again injected back underground to heat up and come back. This turbine then runs a generator, and you finally get electricity. So, this concept is very simple in that sense. Of course, you have to install it carefully, you have to set up this pipe so that it goes somewhere deep and picks up the heat and comes back. You do not want to accidentally start some uncontrolled process. So, you have to look at it, but it is a very clean form of energy, it is already there underground. There is a small element that you are releasing gases which are trapped under the rock layer that is there underground. You are releasing it, but in this process, but that is generally considered an extremely small amount that you are releasing. You can set this up in a relatively clean manner. So, it is a very interesting way in which you tap energy that is already there in the earth. There is no, so it looks vaguely like a thermal power plant, except that there is no coal being burned to generate the heat. You simply have underground heat from the earth that is being tapped. So, that is the geothermal energy process. It is pretty clean, and therefore, it is very interesting to utilize. Then there are a couple of ways in which we can tap ocean energy. There is still energy available in the ocean, and one of them is this OTEC process, ocean thermal energy conversion. So, this is based on the idea that if you actually look at the temperature of the ocean from the surface down deeper, you will find that there is warm water at the top, and it is about 25 degrees centigrade is the temperature. In there, it is there in about in the top layer, which is about 10-20 meters deep. And then when you go much deeper, you can get cold water, which may only be about 5 degrees C in temperature. So, you have about 20 degrees C difference of temperature that is readily available to you in large quantities. There is a massive quantity of water available at 5 degrees centigrade, massive quantity of water available to you at 25 degrees centigrade. So, if you take these two and you run a heat engine based on this temperature difference, you can generate electricity. So, that is basically the idea here. So, they will typically pull out water from which is from deep below, and pull in water also from the top, and then they run this heat engine, and then the averaged out temperature, which will be around 16 degrees C or something, is then pushed back into the ocean. So, this is the general idea. We can maybe look at it in little greater detail at a later point in time, but this is one way in which you can tap energy that is available in the ocean. The other way you can tap it is the idea that you already have a lot of movement of water in the ocean, either in the form of waves which are happening every minute or every few seconds you see waves, or you have the tidal process which is going to happen over several hours. So, both of them are happening and you can tap them. Of course, this has got the tidal process also has got a little bit to do with your geography. First of all, you should have access to the water, you should have access to the seas, only then you can pull this off. And but basically the idea is quite straightforward. If you are looking at wave, you can have an oscillating water column. So, there is a water column, and that is oscillating up and down based on the wave that is coming in and going out. So, every few seconds water is going up and down, and then you can use this process of moving water to compress the air that is above it. So, you compress the air, expand the air, compress the air, expand it, so on. So, you have all these things going on. You can use that to run a turbine. So, this moving air, you convert the moving water to moving air, and that runs a turbine, and then you generate electricity. Maybe the only thing that is a little bit an issue with this oscillating water column is that it can be noisy, it can affect the marine environment and marine animals and birds in a very local area. So, if you are doing large scale installation of this wave based power generation units, then that is something that you have to be little bit concerned about. You can also look at tidal barrage. So, that is the other way in which you can generate electricity. This uses the tidal wave activity. So, it is actually a very interesting way in which you capture it, but again it is limited little bit by geography and the fact that you need some specialized locations for this. You just capture the fact that during high tide the water level rises up, and so you allow the water level to rise up, and then you have these small dams which actually get closed and then they hold that water now at a higher level, and then as the low tide happens, so the water level recedes, you now have this potential energy that has now been stored. You release it in a controlled way back into the sea, but you are generating power in the same during the process. So, this is a very clean way in which you do it. This is relatively smaller dams you can put up at some strategic locations and you can keep generating current, but because of the limitation in the location, you cannot have a significant amount of energy generation through this process. You may have some limitation on upper limit on how much you can pull this off even at an international level, but still there is considerable room for you to do these two processes. So, this is another way in which you can generate energy from natural processes. I will finally finish with this. In all these sources of energy, invariably we find that in the end use you also need to have some kind of storage of this energy, because be it thermal energy, wave energy, tidal energy, etc., wind energy, it turns out that they are never likely to be uniform and continuous through the day. You are going to see fluctuations because that is the nature of how nature behaves, and therefore you need to augment such power or energy generating processes with some energy storage processes, so that from the end user perspective there is a relatively undisturbed and predictable supply of energy. And the most common ones that are used for such activities are electrochemical devices and mostly batteries and fuel cells. So, batteries and fuel cells are extensively used in this context, and they are quite simply what you see here as an arrangement consisting of an anode, a cathode and an electrolyte, and you have oxidation reaction occurring at the anode. You have a reduction reaction occurring at the cathode, and this causes electrons to go through the external circuit, run your load, which is powering a household, and then it comes back to the cathode and completes the reaction. So, this is a typical battery. There is a lot of electrochemical science behind it and engineering behind it, and when we discuss these batteries we will look at that in greater detail. But this is typically there as part of almost any of the other technologies that we have discussed through this class as an overview of non-conventional sources of energy, and therefore we will spend actually a reasonable bit of time trying to understand these devices. So, I will finally close with this slide which we saw right at the beginning. I think through this class we have seen various forms of non-conventional sources of energy, and we have also tried to look at what are the positive aspects of those sources and some drawbacks or limitations of those sources. And again I will alert you to this point that I made in partway into the class, that there are some that are non-conventional, there are some that are renewable, and then there are some that are clean. So, for us actually it is the clean part is what is most interesting to us, and therefore when we look at all these other technologies, does not matter what their classification is, I think we should lean towards the clean aspect of it, and then stay focused on how clean are we actually accomplishing in the technology, how clean a run it is, how clean a technology it is something that will be of interest to us. So, I will always keep emphasizing that through the different discussions that we have in this course. So, with that I will close this class. Thank you.